So our last question is, why in what we call chapter 4 is Paul going to devote now such a large portion of his writing to the idea of faith? What is faith? He's going to ask here in chapter 4, and how does it relate to salvation? Salvation from the wrath of God. Well, if we go back to chapter 3, where Paul first announced this gift of righteousness that saves us from the wrath of God, note what he says here. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. That is, faith is the hinge on which salvation from the wrath of God and the guilt of sin is turns. So it's not only logical then that he would want to make sure we understand precisely what he means by faith, because people have misunderstood what faith is throughout history. And what he's going to do in chapter 4 is he's going to look primarily at Abraham, mostly Abraham throughout the chapter, and Abraham then will become a kind of template from the Old Testament. Well, why from the Old Testament? Because again, notice what he says here, this gift of righteousness is attested. The law and the prophets bear witness to it. It is attested by the law and the prophets. So he's going to go back to the Old Testament and say, faith, what we mean by faith is as the hinge of salvation, is as follows. And he's going to analyze some events in Abraham's life in order to explain to us what belief ultimately means and how it relates to salvation. Now, what are the things he's going to highlight? Well, he's going to highlight 4 specific things in the chapter. Okay, so there's 4 different paragraphs, you might say, or emphases. So the first one is going to be about faith is not a meritorious work. Look at verse 4. To the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. To the one who does not work, but believes, his faith is counted as righteousness, or counted for righteousness, meaning that faith is not a meritorious act. We don't, by believing, put God in our debt. It's not something we've done so that now God owes us the way a boss or a manager or a company might owe us our salary. So that's the first thing he wants to point out. Faith is not itself meritorious. It's something we have to do. We have to believe God, but it is not something that earns us or puts God into our debt. So that's the first paragraph that he focuses on. The second question that he takes up is regarding circumcision. Is this blessing then only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? And the way he approaches this is he wants to know that when was it? How then was it counted righteousness to Abraham? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? Because, of course, there's this famous verse up here, which Paul quotes right here, where it says, Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. That's Genesis 15. And now down here, Paul wants to know in relation to circumcision. That is, in relation to religious duty, religious ceremony. Because obviously God wants us to do things that are duties and that are ceremonies. But how does faith relate to those things? Is it independent from those things, or is it married to those things? How does that work? And so he raises this question, well, when did God say of Abraham, when does the narrative say that Abraham believed God and it was counted him for righteousness? Was it at his circumcision? Was it after his circumcision? Was it before his circumcision? And Paul is assuming that the order of Genesis, the stories in Genesis, are inspired, that you can't reorder the stories and have the inspired book. So the order of the stories is inspired according to Paul. It's authoritative. And the answer, of course, is that Abraham was circumcised not before but after he had already believed God and it was counted him for righteousness. So faith is not the kind of thing that we should associate with things like baptism or the Lord's Supper. Those things are independent from initial belief in God and being delivered from God's wrath. They're good things. They should follow naturally on belief, but they're not the same thing as it. And some people think, by virtue of taking communion or being baptized, that's essentially what belief is, and therefore they're saved. The third area he's going to look at is our inheritance, the question of our inheritance. If it is the adherents of the law who are to be heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. So that he wants to, point out that our inheritance is the promise that originally went to Abraham to be the heir of the world, did not depend upon him doing his works after and following God. Those things were good. They're logical consequences of true belief. But the promise to Abraham that he would be heir of the world is way back in Genesis 15 at the part where it says he believed God. So some people think that we believe God and God saves us now, but our future inheritance of heaven above, the paradise of God, is really dependent on how we do over the years that follow that initial belief. We have to still earn sort of that inheritance above, and if we don't quite do what we're supposed to do, then that inheritance is snatched away. It rests upon our shoulders. And Paul here argues that was not the case with Abram. It was a sure, secure promise of God on the basis of his faith alone. All right, so there's that part. And then the final paragraph is on telling us on exactly how faith achieves this salvation, if that's the right way to say it. How does faith lead to, maybe a better way to describe it, salvation? And what Paul wants to show is that faith does not produce salvation. Faith itself is not a power that I have or you have which can effect or produce salvation. So some people think, if you have enough faith, you can do this. In the power of your faith, you can do certain things. But this is the opposite, actually, of what Paul means by faith. And you see it here, and notice how he talks about it. He says, Abraham did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead since he was 100 years old. In other words, he looked at his body and he knew he could not produce a new life. He was infertile for all practical purposes. And he considered Sarah's womb. Sarah was barren. She was old, and in her womb, she was infertile. She was dead. For all practical purposes, neither of them could produce a new life. They didn't have power in themselves to do that. So what it says is that he was fully convinced that God was able to do what God had promised. So faith is when we're fully assured that God has the wisdom and the goodness to do what he has promised. So faith is itself, as David Gooding says, faith comes out of a bankrupt heart. We're bankrupt. We don't have anything in our account. We don't have a power within us to do anything to save ourselves. It's God. Faith looks to God to do the saving, the work of the saving. Okay? So a nice little illustration of that also from David Gooding is if you could imagine the apostles, if they were theologically enlightened enough to know after Jesus was crucified, but before he was raised from the dead, so let's say it was on the Saturday after his crucifixion, if they realized, if he doesn't rise from the dead, then we have no salvation. So if they could realize that, which I'm not sure that they fully understood everything theologically at that point, but if they could, and they wanted him to be raised from the dead, what they could not do is just gather outside the tomb and hold hands and sing Kumbaya or Amazing Grace and just work up enough belief that if they had enough belief, then that would create the power that could raise him from the dead. Like at the end of Elf, the Christmas movie Elf, where the Santa sleigh can't get off the ground, and they say that it can run on Christmas spirit. And so everybody starts singing, and if they just build up enough Christmas spirit, the Christmas spirit will be the power that causes Santa's sleigh to rise up into the sky, which happens in the movie. This is not what faith is. Faith is the opposite of that. We're fully assured that God has that power and can do the saving. All right, so the question then for the last paragraph of this opening section of the book on salvation from the wrath of God, from the guilt of sin, the question is going to be, what is our response? That's what this paragraph, chapter 5 here, this is all chapter 5, verse 1 to verse 11. What is our response to this? So look through the paragraph, see what sort of things you find of our response to this, and why might these be our responses? What's important about this? So best wishes, and we'll see you next time.